My daughter-in-law stood in the middle of the demolition dust and said, "I accidentally threw away that old ceramic vase in the master bedroom. I thought it was just decor." She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She just waited for me to absolve her. I stared at the empty space on the dresser where my wife's urn had sat for 4 years. Then my phone buzzed. It was the estate lawyer. The renovation was never authorized, and that single call changed everything. I'm 63 years old, 31 years as a civil engineer. I know when a foundation has been compromised. My name is Frank. My wife Carol passed 4 years ago. Her cremated remains sat in a hand-painted urn on our bedroom dresser. That urn was the last thing I saw every night. Then Melissa decided to renovate. She said the urn was an eyesore. She told my son it was just cheap ceramic. And when the demolition crew finished, the urn was gone. The lawyer's call told me the renovation was never authorized. But that phone call also told me something else. Something that made me wonder if the urn was truly an accident at all. Let me take you back to where this really started. Carol died on a Tuesday in October, a stroke, no warning. 1 minute she was watering the hydrangeas in the backyard, the next she was gone. I was at work when the hospital called. I made it there in time to hold her hand while she took her last breath. That image stays with me, her fingers cold against mine. The urn arrived 3 weeks later, a ceramic piece she had picked out years before at a craft fair in Kentucky. She always said it reminded her of the sky at dawn over the Appalachian foothills, pale orange and lavender with a single hand-painted bird. I placed it on the dresser in our bedroom. Every morning I touched the rim and said her name. Every night I said goodnight. Daniel was 29 when his mother died. He took it hard, the way only children do when they have to watch the surviving parent fall apart and then rebuild. He married Melissa about a year after Carol passed. I thought it was too soon, but I kept that to myself. Melissa was sharp, funny, great in sales. She knew how to get what she wanted. And what she wanted, from the very beginning, was to reshape the house into something that erased Carol's presence. It started small. She suggested I repaint the living room. Then she asked about replacing the dining room table Carol had refinished. I said no each time, politely. She smiled and dropped it, but she never stopped circling. About a year into their marriage, Daniel called me on a Sunday evening. He said Melissa had been talking to a contractor. She thought the master bathroom needed updating. I told him the bathroom was fine. He said, "Dad, she's just trying to help." I said, "I don't need help." That's when the pressure started coming from other directions. Melissa's parents, Raymond and Gloria, began showing up at family dinners with comments about how the house needed a woman's touch. Raymond once joked that I was living in a museum. Gloria asked me if I planned to keep Carol's old things forever. I said yes, I did. They laughed like I was being sentimental in a charming way. They were wrong. 6 months before the renovation, Melissa sat me down at the kitchen table. Daniel was at work. She poured herself a glass of wine and told me she had been doing research. She said homes in Greenfield with updated interiors sold for 30% more. She said I was sitting on equity. She said it was almost irresponsible not to modernize. I asked her if she had looked at the house's plumbing and electrical. She hadn't. I asked her if she had considered the structural integrity of the load-bearing wall in the hallway. She blinked. I told her I had built bridges for 30 years, and I knew what happened when people renovated without understanding the underlying structure. She finished her wine and said, "Frank, you're overthinking this." I said, "I'm not overthinking anything." 2 months before the urn disappeared, Daniel came by alone. He looked tired. We sat on the porch. He told me Melissa had been in a mood for weeks. She was pushing him to get me to agree to renovations. She said the house was holding me back. She said Carol would have wanted me to move forward. I looked at my son and said, "Son, I know you love her, but you need to understand something. This house is not a project. This house is where your mother lived and died. That dresser holds her ashes, and I will not let anyone treat that as a staging decision." Daniel nodded. He said he understood. He went home and told his wife. 48 hours later, the contractor showed up at my door at 7 a.m., a short man named Vince with a clipboard and a confident smile. He said Melissa had hired him to do a full kitchen and master bedroom renovation. He said they had a plan approved by the town, and he needed me to sign off on the permit. I took the clipboard. I read the document. It had Melissa's signature, not mine. I said, "This is my house. I didn't authorize this work." Vince shrugged. He said he had a deposit check that had already cleared. He said Melissa told him the homeowners were on board. I handed the clipboard back. I told him to start nothing. He said he would have to call Melissa. That afternoon, Melissa arrived with Daniel in tow. She was holding a folder of design mock-ups. She spread them across my kitchen counter. She showed me where the new cabinets would go, the quartz countertops, the spa-like shower. She said it would take 3 weeks. She said I could stay in the guest room. She said it would increase the property value by at least $40,000. I let her finish. Then I said, no. She leaned forward. She said, Frank, I've already paid the deposit. I've already ordered the materials. You can't just say no. I said, I just did. She looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at the floor. She took the mock-ups and walked out the door. That was a Thursday. By the following Monday, Vince's truck was in my driveway. I called Daniel. He said Melissa was at work. I drove to her office in the pharmaceutical sales building. I walked past the receptionist and found her in a conference room. I closed the door. I said, Melissa, if any contractor steps foot inside my house again without my written permission, I will call the police and I will file a restraining order. She said, you wouldn't do that. I said, try me. She didn't try, but she didn't stop either. 2 weeks later, I came home from my weekly coffee with my friend Howard. There was a demolition dumpster in my driveway. The front door was open. I walked inside. The living room walls were partially torn down. The kitchen cabinets were gone. And when I reached the master bedroom, the dresser was missing. The urn was gone. The room was empty except for dust and a single stray pair of socks. I called Daniel. No answer. I called Melissa. She answered on the first ring. I said, where is the urn? She said, I don't know what you're talking about. I said, the police are on their way. She said, that would be a mistake. And then she hung up. I stood in that empty room. I could still see the faint outline on the dresser where the urn had sat for 4 years. I could still smell her perfume in the wood. And I started to realize something. This wasn't just about renovation. This was about erasing Carol. And I had no idea how far Melissa was willing to go. That's when my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. It said, the urn is safe, but it won't stay that way unless you cooperate. I saved the message. I called Susan Park, my attorney, and that night I wrote in my spiral notebook everything that had happened, every date, every lie, every threat, because I knew then that this was a war and I was not going to lose the only thing Carol left behind. I didn't respond to that text. I took a screenshot, saved it, and forwarded it to Susan Park. Then I went downstairs, made a pot of coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with my spiral notebook. I wrote down the time, the phone number, and the exact wording. 11:47, unknown number. The urn is safe, but it won't stay that way unless you cooperate. I underlined cooperate. That word bothered me most. Not negotiate, not discuss, cooperate. Like I was the one who had done something wrong. Susan called me at 7 the next morning. She said she had already run the phone number through a reverse lookup. It was a burner phone, prepaid, activated 3 days earlier at a convenience store in Lancaster. She said it was registered to no one. She also said the language in the message bordered on extortion, but it wasn't enough alone for a criminal complaint. She told me to brace myself because this was going to get worse before it got better. She was right about that. I spent the next 2 days walking through my own house like a stranger. The kitchen was gutted. The master bedroom was stripped to the studs. The dust had settled on everything, a fine gray powder that coated the furniture I had moved to the living room. I found one of Carol's hairpins on the floor in the hallway, near where her vanity used to sit. I picked it up and held it for a long time. Then I put it in my pocket and kept moving. On the third day, a certified letter arrived. It was from an attorney named Gerald Hutchins, the same one who would later represent Raymond and Gloria in the original story. This time, he was representing Melissa. The letter stated that I had abandoned my property by leaving it in disrepair, that my refusal to allow necessary renovations constituted neglect, and that Melissa, as a family member with concern for my well-being, had taken reasonable steps to preserve the home. It claimed the urn had been moved to a safe location for its protection during construction. It demanded that I sign a power of attorney authorizing Melissa to oversee the completion of the renovation. It gave me 72 hours. I read the letter twice. Then I called Susan. She laughed. She said, Frank, this is the most creatively absurd legal document I have seen in 20 years. She cannot claim you abandoned property while you are living in it. She cannot unilaterally declare neglect to justify trespass. And she cannot hold your wife's ashes hostage as leverage. I asked her what we could do. She said, first, we file a police report for theft of the urn. Second, we send a cease and desist. Third, we find out where that urn is before she does something irreversible. That afternoon, I went to the Greenfield Police Department. I spoke with an officer named Detective Mills, a woman in her 40s with a calm voice and tired eyes. I laid out the timeline. I showed her the text message, the certified letter, the signed contractor agreement with Melissa's name but not mine. I told her about the urn. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Mr. Frank, this isn't a typical theft case. The urn is personal property with sentimental value, but proving criminal intent is difficult if she claims she moved it for safekeeping. However, the text message changes things. That's threatening, that's leverage." She said she would open a case file and assign an officer to contact Melissa. She warned me not to confront her directly. I didn't follow that warning, not exactly. That evening I drove to Daniel and Melissa's house. It was a split level on Ash Street, gray siding, a basketball hoop in the driveway that nobody used. I parked across the street and watched. The lights were on in the living room. I saw Daniel's silhouette through the blinds. I saw Melissa's. She was packing, phone pressed to her ear. I got out of my car and walked to the front door. I knocked. Daniel answered. He looked surprised, then wary. He said, "Dad, you shouldn't be here." I said, "Where is your mother's urn?" He looked down. He said, "I don't know." I said, "You don't know or you won't tell me." He opened his mouth, but Melissa's voice cut through from behind him. "Frank, you need to leave." She stepped into the doorway. She was holding her phone. She said, "I have a lawyer now. Any further communication should go through him." I looked at my son. He wouldn't meet my eyes. I turned and walked back to my car. As I drove away, I saw Melissa watching me from the window. The next morning, a detective from the Greenfield PD called. They had contacted Melissa. She had told them the urn was in her possession for safekeeping and that she would return it once the renovation was complete. She claimed I had agreed to the renovation verbally, that the contractor was working with my implied consent. She said the text about cooperation was a misunderstanding. The detective told me that without physical proof of the urn's location, they couldn't compel her to return it. They suggested civil action. I called Susan. She said, "We file a replevin action. That's a legal demand for return of personal property. It's faster than a full trial. We can get a hearing within 2 weeks." 2 weeks? I spent those 2 weeks living in a construction zone. Vince, the contractor, had stopped working after the police called him, but the damage was done. The walls were open. The plumbing was exposed. The electricity was disconnected in half the rooms. I slept on a cot in the living room. Every morning, I woke up to the sound of the furnace cycling in a house that no longer felt like mine. Then, 11 days before the hearing, I got a second text from the burner number, a photograph. It showed the urn sitting on a table in an unfamiliar room. The background was beige wallpaper with a floral pattern. The urn was wrapped in a towel, but I could still see the hand-painted bird. The message read, "Last chance. Sign the papers or the bird flies away." I forwarded the photo to Susan and to Detective Mills. Susan called me within an hour. She said, "Frank, I know where that wallpaper is. That's the floral print from the guest bedroom at Raymond and Gloria's rental in Lancaster. The urn is in their house." I asked her how she knew. She said, "Because they used the same wallpaper in their last apartment. I saw it in the evidence photos from the tenancy case." That was the first time I learned Susan had represented someone against Raymond and Gloria before. She told me they had a pattern. They had done something similar to a neighbor years back, claiming ownership of personal property after a dispute. That changed everything. This wasn't just Melissa acting alone. This was a coordinated effort with her parents. They had the urn. They were using it as a bargaining chip, and they had done this before. I drove straight to Lancaster. I didn't tell Susan. I didn't tell the police. I parked 2 blocks away and walked to the beige house with the floral wallpaper. I knocked. Gloria answered. She smiled. She said, "Frank, what a surprise." I said, "Where is the urn?" She said, "I don't know what you're talking about." I said, "I have a photograph of it in your house." She stopped smiling. She said, "You need to leave before I call the police." I said, "I am calling the police." And I pulled out my phone and dialed the non-emergency line. Gloria slammed the door. I heard the lock click. I could hear movement inside, quick footsteps, a drawer opening and closing. Detective Mills arrived 20 minutes later with a uniformed officer. She knocked. Gloria opened the door. The detective asked to search the residence. Gloria refused. The detective said, "Then I'll get a warrant." Gloria said, "You'll need probable cause." The detective said, I have a photograph of stolen property inside this residence. That's probable cause. She called the county courthouse. A judge signed the warrant by phone. We waited. The search took an hour. They found the urn in a closet, wrapped in a towel, sitting on a stack of old blankets. Gloria and Raymond were taken in for questioning. The urn was bagged as evidence. Detective Mills handed it to me on the front lawn. I unwrapped the towel. The bird was still there. The pale orange and lavender were still vivid. I held it against my chest, and I cried for the first time in 4 years. But the story wasn't over. When they booked Raymond and Gloria, they found something else in their car, a folder. Inside was a copy of a legal document I had never seen. It was a quitclaim deed for my house, signed with my signature, dated 3 days after the renovation started. Detective Mills showed it to me at the station. She said, "This signature is not yours. We'll need you to confirm that in writing." I looked at the signature. It was close, but the loops on the F were wrong. The capital F in Frank, I always connected the top loop. This one didn't. Someone had forged my name, and that someone, I later learned, was Melissa. I stared at that quitclaim deed on the detective's desk. My signature, but not my handwriting. The capital F wrong, the date wrong, the notary stamp blank. Detective Mills said, "Your daughter-in-law's fingerprints are on this document. We found it in her parents' car. She handled it recently." I asked if they could arrest her. She said, "We have enough for forgery charges, but we need to tie it to the theft and the extortion texts. We are building a case." I drove home holding Carol's urn in the passenger seat. The weight of it felt different now, lighter and heavier at the same time. I placed it back on the dresser in the bedroom, which was still gutted, still exposed. I didn't care about the walls anymore. I had what mattered. But the house itself was in legal limbo. The quitclaim deed had been filed with the county recorder's office. Even though the signature was forged, it created a cloud on the title. No one could sell or refinance the property until the forgery was cleared. Susan explained that Raymond and Gloria had tried to file the deed to transfer ownership to themselves, then planned to take out a home equity loan against the house. The renovation was part of the scheme. Melissa was supposed to finish the work, increase the appraised value, then her parents would cash out and disappear. The urn was leveraged to force me to sign or to keep me distracted. The next morning, I got a call from Daniel. He was crying. He said, "Dad, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know about the deed. She told me she was just trying to help with the renovation." I asked him if he knew about the urn being taken to her parents' house. He paused. He said, "I knew she moved it. She said it was for safekeeping." I said, "Daniel, she forged your name too." He said, "What?" I told him the quitclaim deed had both our signatures. His was also forged, but he hadn't seen the document. He went silent. I said, "You need to come down to the station. They'll need a statement from you." He showed up that afternoon. Detective Mills interviewed him separately. He confirmed he had never signed any deed, never authorized any transfer of property, and had no knowledge of the plan to take out a loan against the house. He looked broken. He asked me if I would ever forgive him. I told him the truth. I said, "I forgive you, but you need to forgive yourself for not seeing what was happening." 2 days later, Melissa was arrested at her office. They charged her with forgery, theft of cremated remains, and extortion. Raymond and Gloria were charged as accomplices. The news spread through Greenfield like wildfire. The local paper ran a story with the headline, "Family Feud Ends in Arrests Over Stolen Ashes and Forged Deed." I didn't read it. I didn't need to. Melissa's attorney, Gerald Hutchins, tried to get the charges reduced. He argued that the urn had been moved for safekeeping and that the quitclaim deed was a misunderstanding. But Detective Mills had the texts, the photo, the signed contractor agreement, and the fingerprints. The prosecutor offered a plea deal. Melissa would serve 18 months, Raymond and Gloria 12 months each, all with 5 years of probation. Melissa refused. She wanted a trial. She insisted that I had verbally agreed to everything, that the deed was a mistake, that the text messages were taken out of context. She wanted to testify. The trial date was set for February 14th, Valentine's Day. The irony was not lost on me. I spent the weeks leading up to the trial living in the half-renovated house. I hired my own contractor, a man named Julio who had worked on the county bridges I designed. He understood structure. He rebuilt the walls properly, fixed the plumbing, ran new electrical. He charged me cost plus a handshake. I helped him on weekends. It felt good to work with my hands again. The The house slowly started to feel like mine again. The night before the trial, I sat in the living room with Carol's urn on the coffee table. I talked to her. I said, "I don't know if you can hear me, but I think you'd want me to let this go. But I can't let it go, not because I want revenge, because if I let it go, then everyone thinks they can take what's yours." I sat there for an hour, then I went to bed. The courthouse was packed on February 14th. The media had picked up the story because of the urn angle: cremated remains theft, family betrayal, a quiet widow fighting back. I wore my best suit. Daniel sat next to me. He had separated from Melissa after the arrest. He was staying at my house. He looked older than his years. Melissa took the stand on day 2. She was composed. She wore a gray blazer and spoke clearly. She said she had only wanted to help. She said I was a hoarder, that I couldn't let go of Carol's things, that the house was falling apart. She claimed I had agreed to the renovation during a phone call. She said she had the notes to prove it. The prosecutor asked to see the notes. Melissa produced a notepad with handwritten entries. The prosecutor asked when she had written them. She said the day after the phone call. The prosecutor asked, "Did you ever show these notes to anyone before today?" She said, "No." The prosecutor asked, "Did you ever mention this alleged phone call in any of your communications with the police or with Mr. Frank's attorney?" She said, "It must have slipped my mind." The jury looked at each other. The prosecutor then played the voicemail Raymond left for me, the one where he said I would understand consequences. The courtroom went quiet. The prosecutor asked Melissa, "Did you hear this voicemail before it was played today?" She said, "No." The prosecutor asked, "Did you know your father left a threatening voicemail for Mr. Frank?" She said, "He was upset." The prosecutor said, "Upset enough to say," and I quote, "You will regret this," end quote. Melissa didn't answer. The trial lasted 5 days. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They found Melissa guilty on all counts: forgery, theft of cremated remains, extortion. Raymond and Gloria had already pleaded guilty before the trial. They were sentenced to the plea deal. Melissa got 2 years in state prison. I stood outside the courthouse. Daniel was beside me. He said, "I'm sorry, Dad, I should have stopped her." I put my hand on his shoulder. I said, "You're here now, that's what matters." I went home that night and sat in Carol's rocking chair. The urn was back on the dresser. The walls were finished. The house smelled like paint and new wood. I touched the rim of the urn and said goodnight. But the story wasn't quite over. 3 weeks later, I received a letter from the county prosecutor's office. They had found something during the investigation: a safe deposit box under Melissa's name. Inside it were documents, not just about my house, about other properties, other families. This was not her first time, and that's when I realized how close I had come to losing everything. The prosecutor's letter sat on my kitchen table for 2 days before I opened it again. Inside was a list of names: 7 property owners across 3 counties, all widowers, all in their 60s or 70s, all with recent renovations started by family members. The safe deposit box held quitclaim deeds, power of attorney forms, and loan applications. Each one bore a signature that had been traced and forged, the same looping capital F that didn't connect at the top. Melissa had been running this operation for at least 5 years. My house was not the first. I called Detective Mills. She said the investigation had expanded. They were cross-referencing Melissa's employment records at the pharmaceutical company. She had access to elderly clients through her sales route. She would identify vulnerable homeowners, then introduce herself as a concerned family friend. I asked how many victims had come forward so far. She said 7 confirmed, but they suspected more. She said one victim, a 72-year-old retired schoolteacher in Chillicothe, had lost his home entirely. He had died in a nursing home while Melissa's parents lived in his house. That case was now under review for elder abuse and wrongful death. The weight of that information settled into my chest like concrete. I had fought back and won, but others had not. And the woman who had done this was the mother of my grandson. Daniel sat across from me at the table. He had been crying again. He said, "Dad, she's going to be in prison for years. Carter is going to grow up without a mother." I said, "She chose this. She knew what she was doing, and she hurt people, Daniel, real people." He nodded. He said, "I know. I just don't know how to tell him." I put my hand on his. I said, "You tell him the truth. When he's old enough, you tell him that his mother made terrible choices, but that he is not defined by her choices. and that his grandfather fought to keep what was right. We sat in silence for a long time. The urn was on the mantel now, in the living room. I had moved it there because the bedroom still smelled like fresh paint, and I wanted Carol to see the light coming through the new windows. It was spring now. The oak tree in the backyard had buds on it. The broader investigation took 8 months. During that time, 7 additional victims came forward. 2 had died before they could testify, but their estates joined the civil suits. Melissa was charged with 18 additional counts of forgery, theft, and fraud. Gerald Hutchins, her attorney, withdrew from the case after it became clear she had lied to him. She was appointed a public defender. Raymond and Gloria, already serving their sentences, were indicted again on conspiracy charges. They cooperated in exchange for reduced time. They provided detailed testimony about how Melissa had recruited them to store stolen property and file forged documents. Gloria said on the stand that Melissa had been doing this since college, forging signatures on student loan applications. It was a skill she never stopped using. The trial for the expanded charges lasted 3 weeks. I testified again, but this time I was not the only one. The school teacher's daughter spoke. A retired firefighter from Hamilton spoke. A widow whose husband's ashes had also been taken, but never recovered, spoke about finding her living room empty except for the demolition debris. She said she still woke up at night looking for the urn. She said it had been 9 months, and she still didn't know where his remains had ended up. The courtroom was silent when she finished. Melissa was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Raymond and Gloria got 5 years each, suspended to 3 with probation. The judge called the operation a systematic exploitation of grief and trust. He said, and I wrote this down in my notebook, "You targeted the most vulnerable moment in a person's life, the moment after they have lost someone they loved. You took their memories and tried to turn them into cash. That is not a crime of opportunity, that is a crime of character." I came home from the sentencing and sat in the rocking chair. Daniel came over with Carter. The boy was crawling now. He had Carol's nose, just like I had noticed in the hospital. I held him in my arms and bounced him gently. He grabbed my finger and laughed. I looked at Daniel and said, "He's going to be okay. We're going to make sure of that." The house was finished. Julio had done beautiful work. The kitchen had new cabinets, but I kept Carol's old cookbook rack. The master bedroom had fresh drywall, but I kept her jewelry box on the nightstand. The urn sat on the mantel in the living room, where I could see it every time I walked through the front door. I placed the hairpin I had found in the hallway beside it. It felt right. I continued my documentation. I added a new section to my spiral notebook titled What I Learned. I wrote down the dates, the names of the other victims, the court rulings. I wrote down the voicemail transcript from Raymond. I wrote down the safe deposit box inventory. I wrote down the sentence, 12 years. I wrote down Carol's name at the top of every entry, because everything I did for her. There was one more surprise. 6 months after the trial, I received a certified letter from the estate of the schoolteacher in Chillicothe. His daughter had found a note among his belongings. In it, he had written about a conversation he had with a stranger at a coffee shop, a woman who said she could help him with his renovation. She had asked him about his late wife. He had mentioned where he kept her ashes. He had described the urn. The note included the name of the coffee shop, the date, and a description of the woman. It was Melissa. She had scouted him the same way she had scouted me. The letter included a request. The daughter asked if I would be willing to speak at a restorative justice circle. She said she wanted to hear from someone who had successfully reclaimed what was stolen. She said it might help her let go of her anger. I wrote back and said yes. That circle took place in a community center in Chillicothe. There were 8 of us, victims and family members. We sat in a circle of folding chairs. We told our stories one by one. When it was my turn, I said, "I am 63 years old. I lost my wife 4 years ago. A woman I trusted took the last physical piece of her from my home. I got it back. But I know that some of you did not. I'm not here to tell you it gets easier. I am here to tell you that it is worth fighting for. Even when the fight is ugly, even when the fight costs you things you didn't expect to lose, because what they took was not just property, it was memory, and memory is the only thing we really own." The room was quiet. The schoolteacher's daughter was crying silently. She nodded at me. I nodded back. I drove home that evening with the windows down. The spring air smelled like cut grass and rain. I thought about Carol. I thought about the oak tree, I thought about the urn on the mantle, and I thought about what comes next. Because the story doesn't end when the verdict is read. The story ends when you decide what you're going to do with what you've learned. And I was just beginning to understand what that meant. I'm 63 years old. I have a house that is whole again, a grandson who has Carol's nose, and a son who is learning to trust himself again. The urn sits on the mantle where I can see it every morning when the light comes through the new windows. I touch it sometimes just to remind myself that some battles are worth fighting. But what stays with me is the question I cannot answer. How many others are out there? How many quiet widowers, grieving alone in houses that still smell like someone they lost, are being approached by someone who smiles and says, "I can help"? Melissa had a system. She scouted at coffee shops, at support groups, at pharmacies. She found the ones who said yes too easily, the ones who were too tired to argue, and she took from them what they could not replace. The legal framework for cremated remains is clear. The right of disposition belongs to the surviving spouse. Theft of ashes can be prosecuted, but a piece of paper does not stop a person who has already decided they do not care about the law. What stops them is a witness, a neighbor who notices the dumpster in the driveway, a friend who asks to see the contractor's permit, a family member who says no. I built bridges for 31 years. Every bridge has a load limit. Every structure has a point where it will fail if you push too hard, and every person has a line that should not be crossed. I drew mine in a spiral notebook with a pen, the way my father taught me, and I held it. But I was lucky. I had Susan Park. I had Detective Mills. I had a son who eventually chose to see the truth. Not everyone has those things, and I cannot stop thinking about the school teacher's urn that was never recovered. Somewhere out there, someone is carrying a piece of a stranger's past, and they do not even know what they took. I still sit in Carol's rocking chair on Sunday mornings. I watch the oak tree we planted together. I hold my grandson and I tell him stories about the grandmother he will never meet. I tell him she had a laugh that could fill a room and hands that could fix anything. I tell him she picked out that urn at a craft fair in Kentucky because it looked like the sky at dawn. I tell him that some things are worth fighting for and that the fight itself is part of the memory. So if you are watching this and you recognize something familiar, do not wait. Document, call someone, say no, because the foundation holds only if you maintain it. That was true for bridges. It turned out to be true for everything else. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, stories about people who refused to let go of what mattered most, hit subscribe. Because the truth is, there are more battles to be told. And I, for one, am still listening.